Hey everyone, Scorpius here and welcome back to the channel. With the season in Path of Exile 2 coming to an end and a massive update, possibly even a new league on the horizon, I wanted to go out with a bang. Over the past few days, I've been having as much fun as possible before the season wraps up with what I can easily call the most broken build I've ever played so far. Through our live streams over on twitch.tv/Scorpius_ENT and here on YouTube, alongside some brilliant minds in our community, we managed to create an absolute monster of a build in just a single day. The full crit Spark Sorceress. This powerhouse has 1 life, 0 energy shield, over 7,500 mana, and a staggering 600 plus DPS, clearing T18 fully juiced up maps in 3 minutes and even melting T4 Uber bosses within seconds. And since so many of you have been asking me about this build over on the streams, despite it being late in the season, I decided to put together a very quick breakdown so you can try it out yourself. Just a quick disclaimer before we look into this build is that this version of the build that you will see, like the gear and the jewels, are pretty expensive to get. However, it doesn't mean that you cannot focus on the same stats and the same mods on cheaper items. You could definitely do this build at 10 divine, 20 divine, 150 and even over 200. It all depends on how much budget you've got to spare. Obviously, the more divine you have, the closer you'll get to my numbers. So the big question I get asked is, why do we have 1 life and 0 energy shield? And how do we survive? Well, the reason we have 1 life is Chaos Inoculation, which sacrifices our life but makes us immune to chaos damage, which is massive. Our energy shield is 0 because of Eldritch Battery, which takes all the energy shield that we have on our gear and converts it into mana. And the way that we survive is our mana, through the node called Mind Over Matter, which makes all damage taken to be from the mana first. In this build, mana is the most important thing as it's our main damage multiplier through the spell Archmage, and it's also our main defensive too. So first goal here is to stack as much mana as we possibly can. And there are a few ways to do that. Number 1, we need as much intelligence as possible. Number 2, we need as much maximum mana as possible. Number 3, we need as much energy shield as we can find on our gear, which will then be converted to mana as well through the node Eldritch Battery, as we said before. Once we build a high mana base, we also want to make sure that we have high mana regen too, which will prevent us from losing a lot of mana, which essentially is our health, and main reason we stay alive. And lastly, we also focus on a lot of crit in this build, which makes our sparks melt anything they touch. So firstly, let's begin with the abilities, which majority are identical to the previous version that we have here on Max Roll for the early endgame. First of all, we've got Spark, which is the main ability, and we go for support gems like Inspiration to lower the mana cost, Consider Casting for more damage, less cast speed, Arcane Tempo to bring back the cast speed up, Acceleration for more projectile speed, and Lightning Mastery for the levels. Then we have Flame Wall with the exact same support gems as before, Fire Mastery, Fortress, Mobility, and of course Spell Cascade, so we can create 2 more circles. We then have Orb of Storms, which is one of the main boss abilities, with things like Lightning Exposure and Strip Away for the exposure effects, Font of Mana for 40% increased mana regen, Overabundance so we can be able to place 2 orbs instead of 1, and then Overpower for 50% more stun buildup. Then we have Conductivity, which is our second boss ability, and we put on Heightened Curse, Ritualistic Curse, Cursed Grounds, and Focused Curse. Next, we've got our main aura, Archmage. The only support gem that we need here is Clarity, so we can get 30% mana regen out of it. And lastly, we have a brand new ability here compared to the previous build, which is Cast on Shock. Cast on Shock can be at level 20, but the ability that we put on is Lightning Conduit at level 13, so it doesn't drain our mana. Lightning Conduit is going to deal a massive amount of damage, especially if your targets are shocked, which is why we're going to focus on shock magnitude and shock chance as well. With Lightning Conduit on Cast on Shock, we also want energy retention and impetus. And of course, just like before, we do have Sigil of Power and Blink as our second slot. Sigil of Power, you want to have Magnified Effect for the range, and Persistence so you can stick on the ground for 40% more. And then on Blink, we want Ingenuity. Something important to note about the abilities, you want all of these abilities to be as high level as you possibly can, and all of them should have 20% quality on them. The only exception here is Lightning Conduit, which you want to stick to level 13. Once again, don't forget that this is a very expensive version of this build, and you can do this based on your budget as well. All you need to do is find gear with similar mods or lower stats. So starting things off, our helmet has Energy Shield on it, Maximum Mana, critical hit chance, intelligence, and fire resistance. These are the most important modifiers. For example, maximum life is a dead mod here. Energy shield, we need it because it's going to be converted by Eldritch Battery, and then obviously we want as much maximum mana, crit, and intelligence as possible. Fire resistance was a choice because that's the one that I had to cap. Moving on to the chest, we have a lot of energy shield once again for Eldritch Battery. We have 49 to spirit, a little bit of intelligence, cold, and lightning resistance. Moving on, we've got the ingenuity belt, of course, at 78%. The higher you go, the better. The boots have 30% movement speed, a little bit of energy shield, maximum mana, and intelligence, of course, and then the rest are resistances. Pretty similar to that, our gloves have almost the same modifiers with maximum mana, energy shield, critical damage bonus, intelligence, and resistance as well. Our breach ring has 2 dead modifiers in here, the evasion and maximum life. However, it has an insane amount of maximum mana, very good intelligence, decent lightning resistance, and 100% mana regen. This 100% is going to be enhanced by ingenuity belt, of course, so it's massive. Our second ring, we managed to get the Dream Fragments. Obviously, this, in the current state, is over 100 divine right now to get a good piece, but you can find another breach ring very close to this one to replace the Dream Fragments. If you do have the budget, this is our BIS for this version of the build. This ring gives us cold resistance, increased maximum mana, which is insanely good, 51% increased mana regen, and of course, the best thing on this ring is you cannot get chilled or frozen, which is literally our only kryptonite with this build. Then we have the amulet, which we allocated insightfulness, which is pretty decent for this build as well, as it gives you a maximum energy shield, mana regen, and intelligence. But this amulet is really good because it has a 15 to intelligence, maximum mana, plus 36 to spirit, plus 3 levels to all spell skills, which is what makes this amulet a little bit more expensive, 39 to intelligence, and of course our fire resistance as well. And lastly, our weapons, we have the wand with 21% of damage as extra lightning damage, 26% on spell damage, 102 to maximum mana, plus 5 to level of all lightning spell skills, 76% critical hit chance for spells, and 32 to intelligence. A massive wand. Try and find similar modifiers. If you need to drop the levels of lightning spell skills by 1 or 2, do that as long as you can afford it. And then our focus, we have 30% increased energy shield, 44 on spell damage, 127 to maximum mana, plus 2 levels of all skills, critical spell damage, and increased cast speed. For the runes on the majority of the items, you're going to see that we have the Soul Core Xalatal, which increases our maximum mana by 2%. So if you put it on the focus, on the boots, on the gloves, and on the helmet, you're going to have a total of 8% increased maximum mana. The reason why we put the iron rune on the chest is because the chest has a lot of energy shield, so adding 60% or 40% increased energy shield is going to make a big difference on the mana that you're going to get from Eldritch Battery. If we had a helmet with more energy shield, we would probably put an iron rune here instead of the soul core. Another important thing to note is that you definitely need the Melting Maelstrom mana flask if you will go for this version. This is going to save you on countless times. And another thing is that if you don't have the Dream Fragments, you definitely want to have the Frozen Charm instead of the Stone Charm. When you do get the Dream Fragments, you can then change to the Stone Charm so you can reduce the amount of stuns that you get. Moving on, let's go and see the passive tree, starting off with the Ascendancy. First 2 points, we're going to go for Strike Twice and Shaper of Storms for all of the shock stuff that we're going to get here. And then we're going for Constant Gale and Force of Will so we can get the buff Arcane Surge. Arcane Surge increases our cast speed and mana regen, which is really good for this version. Okay, so now for the passive skill tree, I'm gonna try and simplify things slowly and break them down in each area on its own so I don't confuse you, because you need to know what jewels you're gonna need so you understand how to scale this passive tree, and without those jewels, the tree is gonna be very different. So we're gonna take each area on its own, but the main point here is to get 3 different things. We need, obviously, on the left top side, Mind Over Matter that causes all damage that we take to be taken from the mana. We need to get Eldritch Battery, which will convert Energy Shield to mana from our gear. And of course, we're getting Chaos Inoculation, which is what causes our health to go to 1, but immune to chaos damage. Once we have these three out of the way, what we want to focus on is having 99% of our attribute nodes be as intelligence and only 1, 2, or 3 of them be dexterity and strength, depending on the gear that we have and the abilities that we need. But the most important things that we want to do is unlock as many jewels as we possibly can. So for example, once we finish with this whole line right here and we turn to the left, we have our first jewel, which looks something like this. This is the From Nothing Diamond, and we want the Eldritch Battery specifically, which what this does is we can pick up the most important nodes without needing to path to them. So what I chose is getting things like Branching Bolts that increases 60% chance of lightning skills to chain an additional time. We got our Ether Flow, which this is very important because it increases our mana regen, especially whenever we're moving. We're getting Arcane Intensity for the spell damage, and Raw Mana for increased mana, which if we increase our mana, it's more defensive and more damage. The second jewel that we're going to get is all the way up here, which is going to be the Time Lost Sapphire. Within this one, I found 3 different mods that are really good. 2% mana regen, 7% critical hit chance, and 10% magnitude and shock. So once we place this one, any nodes, passive, small, notables, whatever it is that we put in here is gonna give us these stats as well. Bear in mind that this is a very expensive jewel right now in the market. What you could do is find the same one, but minimize the numbers of those modifiers. So because of this jewel, I invested a little bit more into going for Touch of the Arcane. We put all of these nodes here, Breaking Point, Storm Charged, and of course, going for Overzealous so we can get that extra cast speed. We obviously make our way down here for this jewel, this is a normal jewel that gives us spell damage, critical hit, recover 2% of mana on kill, and magnitude of ailments. The reason I wanted to show you this one before everything else is because with this version, you definitely need at least one jewel that has 2% of mana on kill. It's pretty mandatory to have at least one. Next, if we go all the way up here, we have our third most important jewel here, which is Controlled Metamorphosis. We want this as a massive ring. You're gonna see it says only affects passives in massive ring, nothing below that, because if you get a lower one, the ring is not gonna be as big and you're not gonna be able to get these things. So here we care about pure power. We get controlled magic into these two for the critical spell damage bonus, and then of course we get lightning quick and drenched without even pathing through them. Then moving on, we go all the way down here. This is an empty one. We can put another jewel, but I'm going to show you what the jewels look like. If we go all the way down here, you're going to see our next jewel, which is what you're going to also put up here. And the normal jewels should look something like this: critical damage bonus, shock duration, elemental damage, trigger spells as well is really good. Something similar to this one, you can also put it here. You can go for things like, instead of elemental damage, you can go for spell damage. Instead of critical damage bonus, you can go with critical hit. And then we're going to scale all the way down here, grab ourselves Wild Storm, of course, get Throat Seeker, really good as well. And the last thing that we have here is this beautiful little circle too, which makes perfect sense for our crit build. We have the Against the Darkness Diamond with 1% increased maximum mana, which is not bad, and 4% increased intelligence. So every small passive and notable passive that we put here, we're gonna get these modifiers, but we're benefiting from a lot of nodes because of this jewel. But this is how the whole tree looks. That's why you have so many different rings, and it looks a little bit complicated, but if you break it down, it's pretty simple as to what we're getting. But yeah, you could definitely do this build with as low as 50 divine if you do have it, or even lower than that. You can always try it. As long as you're higher level, above level 19, you can go to all of these paths here, and you get a few gems that are decent with lower mods. It's okay if you're missing 1 or 2 jewels like the Eldritch Battery. It's fine. You could just path through them instead of just picking them through the jewel if you cannot afford it. But it's a very fun build if you manage to get some currency into it for the end of the season. If you have any questions about this build or you need any help, you can comment down below or join the lives here on YouTube or over on twitch.tv/Scorpius_ENT. Our community is amazing, and I'm sure we'll be able to help out with spare items or currency. It's the end of the season, and all we're trying to do is experiment with builds and have as much fun as possible. I'm live every day, Monday to Friday, and once the league comes out on April 4th, I'll be live on weekends too. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as I'll be releasing a lot of PoE2 content and leveling guides for all the new classes that are upcoming. Thank you for watching, and as always, I'm gonna see you guys on the next one. Peace.